name is Dr. Nick Bowman, and I'm an associate professor in the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. During the spring of 2020, I was the Wu Ching Jie Arts and Culture Fellow, where I was working at Zhengda. And before I start my presentation, I want to first thank the Taiwan Institute for Governance and Communication Research for sponsoring some of my stay and inviting me to speak with you today to talk a bit about open science practices. During the presentation, I'm going to invoke the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who was the rather surly gentleman seated into the picture in front of us, who talked a lot about the nature of change. And I see a lot of parallels between the way that Heraclitus saw change and the way that the scientific method and our practices of engaging and producing science also change. I'm going to make a case for considering open science practices in communication science. During our presentation, we'll have 5 agenda items. I'm going to review sort of where these open science practices come from. I'm going to outline an agenda that was recently published in the Journal of Communication that speaks towards how these practices might work in communication science. I'm going to discuss some concerns over open science practices and how they might influence us in ways we're unexpecting and in ways could harm us. And I want to also talk about some special considerations for political communication research. And finally, I'll end with a very brief conversation on some steps we can take in order to make our scientific practice more sturdy, more sound, more robust, and hopefully gain the confidence of the people around us. So to start off, where did all of this come from? Well, Heraclitus was, at least from a Western perspective, is often credited with the idea of this saying here, that change is the only constant in life. That if we're looking for things around us, or if we're looking for routines and patterns that rarely alter their course, well, change is the pattern. And in fact, I would argue that change is really one of the only constants in science itself. It is how science works. It is the nature in which we build knowledge on previous knowledge and walk through, our paradigm. One of the ways that we can think about this change is by looking at Kuhn in his life cycle of science, where we think about how we start off engaging in normal science, where we have assumptions, we have models, we have precepts, we have axioms and theories, and we're testing those things. And we're all working around a relatively shared understanding or agreement as to what it is we're studying. And of course, as we do that, we're bound to find some kind of anomaly. We're bound to find some kind of data point that doesn't quite match up with our assumptions, and maybe we start off by blaming the instruments, or we look to see if our sample is wrong, or perhaps we ran the numbers incorrectly. And of course, we come to find out that the anomaly is replicated by somebody else, and then somebody else. So then before you know it, we get to a crisis stage where suddenly the things that we believe to be true about political communication, or in my field, media psychology, suddenly don't seem to be so accurate anymore. And we change our worldviews, and we may even engage in an entire paradigm shift. And this process is cyclical, and it's iterative, and it's summative, and in a very real sense, it reminds us that science is always adapting, that change is really the only constant in science, almost by the way in which we engage our own scientific method. In fact, there are things about science that might seem constant. We can think about Merton's scientific norms, the ways in which we certify knowledge, and we'd like to think that even if our knowledge and our methods and our production processes are changing, that our sort of broader sense of morals towards science wouldn't change. And Merton gives 4 of these moral norms. One is universalism, that science should be inclusive, and it shouldn't really exclude anybody based on creed or perspective or viewpoint. We'll test any idea, even if the idea isn't very good, we'll find out through the data, not because we agree we don't like it, right? Communality, that science is owned by the collective, that a scientist doesn't own their finding, that we all own all the findings, and that we're adding to a broader scientific record. Disinterestedness is the notion that we shouldn't be personally vested in our findings and our practice. We shouldn't be investigating things merely because we want to find a particular result, or perhaps we shouldn't be so personally vested in our research that we fail to be objective. And then finally, skepticism. Most of us are working from a paradigm of falsification, where by definition we are working towards trying to find ways to reject what it is we just found. And of course, over the trajectory of a research program, we find that, we can't prove this thing wrong, and so maybe we reluctantly accept. In a way, we never prove anything so much as we reluctantly accept our inability to disprove something, which gives us, we think, pretty good evidence that whatever's in front of us might approximate the truth. Now, as to whether or not we currently uphold even Merton's norms listed on the screen, probably not. And in fact, I want to show you over the next couple slides that maybe as a field as a whole, we often fall short, likely of all four of these moral imperatives. For example, universalism. There has been quite a bit of debate in the field of communication studies around representativeness in our authors and our scholarship, whether that's a failure to cite scholars from different parts of the world and from different parts, from different underrepresented groups. We know from the Communications So White article that a large number of scholars in our field, and likely far more than chance and far more than we would expect, tend to be white and tend to be males. And along with that, we see that we have these things called weird findings. And when we talk about a weird finding, we're talking about populations that we study that tend to be white or European or some descent. And the point there is that our data is being based on populations that often fail to represent the diversity of the earth as a whole. So if we have authors who aren't really representing the diversity of scholars and the diversity of experiences in our field, and then we have data based on individuals who often aren't representing their underlying constituencies, that becomes a bit of a problem. And so some have argued that we don't always meet the standard with universalism. With communality, we have lots of debates in our field around whether or not data or research belongs to a scientist. If you think about this anecdotally, we tend to talk about somebody's work, or we tend to talk about somebody's findings. And of course, that's a way for us to give credit where credit is due. But we also run into problems where there is a sense that if I do a study, it is mine to do with as I please. Other individuals do not have the right to have access to that study and those materials. There was a recent editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine referring to data parasites. And these are individuals who seemingly surf websites for other researchers' data and then attempt to do some kind of replication or analysis with that data. And of course, the critique was that the parasites aren't collecting any of the data, but they're profiting from the data itself. And I want to come back to that a little later, because in a way, we might argue that research parasites are, besides being a pejorative term, are actually kind of an important part of the scientific process, besides the fact that I think the anecdote's a bit overblown. So we often do not share our materials. Anybody who is on this call right now who has ever had a difficult time finding items from a scale on a previous project knows what I'm talking about when we say that we don't tend to share things very well. We tend to fail on disinterestedness, right? We know that there are quite a few issues in our field with how the peer review process works. I'm sure that everybody on the call who is a working scientist has had frustrations with reviewer 2 being unfair, or having a paper desk rejected because the editor doesn't seem to like the theory or like the perspective. And sometimes it's really hard to see if the critiques are scientific in nature, or if the critiques might be something a little more along the way of being personal in nature, or perhaps they just don't like your theory, don't like your methods, don't like your results. I I study entertainment media primarily, and so you can imagine that oftentimes I have reviewers who will say things like, I don't understand why we're spending serious time studying video games or virtual reality. So we know we have issues here. Likewise, we know that different peer review systems have implications for the types of research that get published, which seems to suggest that there could be some bias involved in those processes. And then finally, skepticism. And on the one hand, we sort of giggle at this one, right? Because we're all very skeptical people. We're skeptical of each other. We're skeptical of ourselves. We're skeptical of our students. And again, if we're coming at this from a falsification paradigm, we are skeptical people. But at the same time, we seem to be awfully quick to accept results on their face, right? If someone publishes something, one paper, one study, especially if we like the results of that study, we're very quick to accept those, cite those, and move on. I'm sure that many of us have been guilty of finding a citation to support a point we're trying to make in a paper and then moving on to the next paragraph. And, it's sometimes just as easy to find another citation that disagrees with that point. Oftentimes we get in fights around this when we're in the peer review process. Right? So I might go even further and say that if we're going to change some of these practices to at least engage the morals that we say we're going to be engaging, change is one of the only constants of the work of science as well. So not only the concept of science, but also the work involved in the scientific process. And one of those changes in science work that I want to talk about is the idea of open science practices. Now, if we were gathered together, first you'd be able to see me. I've intentionally hidden my camera because I have not been able to receive a haircut in about 3 months. So to hide my shame, I've stayed voice only on this one. I've also been told I have a face for radio, so I think we'll just go ahead and stick with the slides here. We have seen communication scholars writing about open science and what it could mean for our field. Neil Lewis wrote a great article in Communication Methods and Measures, and I've written one with Justin Keene, a colleague of mine at Tech, in the Communication Research Reports. But we have seen a trickling of these editorials trying to explain what I mean when I say open science. And really it comes down to this. Open science practices are about making the research process more transparent. Essentially, it's the idea, and this is actually a line that Justin wrote in our manuscript, of going from, trust me, I'm a scientist, to here, let me show you how I did what I did. And I say that because oftentimes I think people hear open science and they seem to ascribe a perspective that suggests that what we're doing is investigations, that the idea is we can't trust any researchers, and so we need to make sure to vet them and shake them down and request their data and go after them. And that is not really the purpose of what's going on here, but rather it comes from a belief that we can make the scientific process much more transparent and therefore much more accessible to others. Now we realize, of course, that transparency doesn't tap all of the norms that we talked about with Merton. But I would argue that at least 2 of them are tapped quite well. First, transparency through open science practices creates a scholarly community. We're all sharing everything. And I'll talk about the mechanics of that here in a moment. But it taps the notion of communality. And second, it taps the notion of skepticism because it allows us to be informed skeptics. Anybody who's ever gotten reviewer 2 that just will sort of levy allegations against a paper of yours, and you end up writing 4 or 5 or 6 pages explaining that you didn't do what they're accusing you of doing, and you run some extra analyses or file some extra, literature review arguments, has been through this before, where sometimes we're just not trusted, and the open science practices can maybe help us, in a way, make us better skeptics so that we can all be more confident in the research that we're sharing. So I realized at this point, I've talked very conceptual, and I think now for this part of the presentation, I want to speak a little more nuts and bolts, a little more operationally about what we can do to make science and communication open. So in this part of the presentation, we have 7 points in this agenda for open science that are part of a manuscript that was recently published in the Journal of Communication. This manuscript came out maybe a couple of weeks ago. The very last slide of this presentation, I will have a link to that manuscript, and I was happy to be a part of this team of authors. 3-4 dozen people, and one of the things I want you to know is that we did not come to the project with this agenda already set. In fact, it was very much an agenda building process, right? You can imagine with 30-40 people, we had about 30-40 items on the agenda, and we had to argue pretty fervently and pretty aggressively at some times about which things were reasonable, which things were unreasonable, what were points that we all agreed on, what were points that were minority opinions, and we were able to finally whittle down the list of open science practices to the 7 you see here. And of course, even these 7 we have some disagreement with. In fact, after this presentation, you're going to be invited to submit questions so I can answer those, follow up in a text or maybe even a follow-up video. And I'm very excited to hear your critiques, concerns, and questions because we see this as an ongoing process. As I've said already in this presentation, change is the only constant in science work. That being said, these 7 agenda points I think are pretty strong. I think they're pretty achievable, and I think they're going to give us the best gains we can have in terms of ensuring that communication science can withstand the test of time. Let's talk about all 7 of them now. So probably the most obvious one, and the one that draws the most amount of attention, is publishing more of your research. And I don't mean publishing more manuscripts. Rather, what I'm referring to here is publishing more of the work that you're doing. This might be your study materials. This might even be your analysis data in the code you actually use to generate your statistical results for your manuscript. This is referred to as open materials and open data. Oftentimes, this part of the process involves us being a bit vulnerable, right? Because we're literally asking researchers to, take your survey items and load them up onto a server, or, take your stimulus materials or your experimental protocols. A lot of those documents that are part of the research process and certainly are part of your manuscript, but we never really read those to people, right? What I have on screen right now is an example of my own OSF space, Open Science Framework space, and you can use that link and activate this box you see here. This was a project I did where I was generating a scale of perceived demand in video games. It's actually part of my Fulbright work this spring. Well, I ran into a problem. And that I had the scale finished, I had the data finished, we had a large set, we did our, measurement validity tests, we were very proud of them, we used some exploratory structural equation modeling, which is a relatively new technique for me. But I had a book coming out at the same time, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to wait for the journal review process to have this manuscript vetted. So I talked to my colleagues, I talked to the book publisher, and we decided to include this manuscript is chapter 13 in my book, which of course immediately opens up criticism. So Bowman's the editor of the book, and Bowman chapter 13 is this brand new scale that's supposed to be so good, he says. Well, surely there's bias there. Well, one of the ways I tried to combat that was by making everything transparent. It's like, here's the manuscript, here's the data, here's the survey itself. We had a Word version, we even had a Qualtrics version. And the hope was that readers who were skeptical of this work could log on to that OSF space and look at all the materials for themselves. Well, it turns out that publishing your materials and your data and your code has some benefits for science. One of the biggest ones is it facilitates reproduction and replication studies. Reproduction refers to other individuals taking your data and reproducing your results. It's basically a check. Replication, of course, which we'll talk about in one of my other points for the agenda of open science, is encouraging people to take your research and extend on it. Well, that's really easy to do if you give people the materials you use in your own study. I think I've said this already in the presentation, but nothing's more frustrating than trying to find like a 20-item scale that somebody used in a landmark study, and then you find the landmark study, and all you can find there are 3 sample items, and you're forced to dig around the literature to find the other 17, or create them on your own. Maybe you can contact the researcher, but many of us move institutions over our careers. In fact, if you would have emailed me 2 years ago, I was at West Virginia University. That email address, 7 days after I left campus, they shut it down. So it can be quite hard to get a hold of people. The other thing that publishing these materials and this data and this code does is it provides a resource for knowledge creation. We start to see project files to where, early career scholars and even established scholars who want to learn an area of research can see the manuscripts, but they can also see the study materials, the old data, the old code, and other aspects of the research process that really make a manuscript come to life. It can also reduce p-hacking and other statistical tricks because, especially when you're sharing your code and your syntax, you're sort of time-stamping your analysis plan. You're giving it to people. And we can always forensically look at the data for ourselves to see if maybe you've got a finding that doesn't quite add up, but we take your file and we can reproduce the finding, then we might have more confidence that that wasn't something that was found after the fact. Related to that last point about p-hacking, another open science practice is the notion of pre-registration. So if you look at the circle on your slide here, many of you are going to recognize this research practice, right? You observe something in the world and you want to know more about it. So you consult the literature, you consult theory, you look at prior work, and you stand on the shoulders of giants and you propose your own study. And then you design that study. Well, normally we design it, conduct it, analyze it, report it. And we wouldn't really draft our manuscript until the report stage, and we would send that manuscript out for journals to review. Pre-registration, which for some people is one of the more controversial open science practices, puts a pause in that process. And before you go from design to conduct, you essentially time-stamp your study. And what we mean there is you mark down your predictions, your study methodology, and even your planned data analysis. And you mark that at a point in time. And you do that before the study continues. The idea behind pre-registration, this time-stamping prior to data collection, is that then when you do the rest of the study, it truly is confirmatory research because you've indeed marked, I'm going to do this exact thing. I'm going to run this ANOVA with this conditions on these participants. And it sort of cuts down to what some people have called the forking paths problem, where the researcher makes several sort of post hoc decisions that might guide their research along finding maybe the shiniest story and not the story that's the most honest towards the original prediction. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that when you pre-register a study that you cannot do post hoc or exploratory analyses. Instead, what you're doing is you're clearly separating your predictions from your explorations. In your manuscript, for example, you might say, we pre-registered this part, and here's what we did, and then here are the things we did that are not pre-registered, and you separate that out. Registered reports are a very specific type of pre-registration, to where at that design to conduct the study stage, you actually submit your manuscript to a journal. So you do the observation, consulting, proposing, designing. You essentially write the front end of your manuscript all the way up to your data analysis plan, and you submit that to a journal. And the editor and the reviewers take just that manuscript to make their publication decision. And that might sound a bit weird to a lot of folks on the call, because how could you possibly accept a manuscript if you don't know what the study results were? And the argument here is that by sending in the manuscript plans, two things happen. One is the authors have to agree to follow the plans that they proposed. Again, they can still explore, but that has to be done post hoc and marked that way. But manuscripts start to be accepted based on the quality of the science and not simply the novelty of the results. So a lot of folks believe that the registered report format is especially useful for protecting null result manuscripts. We do know there is a bias towards publishing statistical significance, and yet what that can result in is lost resources and lost knowledge when we start to realize that all of those things that get rejected are likely null findings, which leads to the file drawer effect, right, where we take manuscripts, throw them away, and then we overestimate the prevalence of a phenomenon. So the second agenda for open science is pre-registering your studies and even submitting registered reports. What are some of the benefits? It clearly distinguishes between exploratory and confirmatory work. It reduces things like harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, because there's no longer a benefit to harking, because you already separate out your predictions from your explorations. And it also reduces publication biases and the file drawer effect. The third point of the agenda that I want to draw attention to is the importance of replication studies. We know that in many social sciences, we're having what's called a replication crisis, where individuals are going back to canonical or wildly accepted sort of like the foundational studies in their fields. We're seeing this in social psychology a little bit. And when they try to replicate the results of those landmark manuscripts, they don't replicate. And there's been a lot of high-profile cases, which we cover in the JOC manuscript, where these really sexy, the hamburger on the left, the really good-looking one you're going to see in your advertisement, doesn't really match the hamburger you get handed when you go to the restaurant itself. Pardon the use of hamburgers. I'm back in Texas now. I've been eating a lot of hamburgers lately. And this is a problem when we're not skeptical enough, when we just accept the publication as a result and we move on. One of the things we need to do as part of the open science perspective is replicate more of our established work. Again, going back to the earlier points, it's easier to do replications if you have access to study materials. And of course, if you're pre-registering replications, you can somewhat avoid the publication bias issue. There are two different types of replication studies. There is the exact replication, where you're trying to see if a finding from group A could be found by your research group. And you're doing the study exactly as it was done in the other location. Now, some would argue there's no such thing as an exact replication, because you always have a different setting, a different time, maybe a different culture. But the idea is to, as much as possible, emulate the study that you want to see still holds up. So you take a finding. In fact, one of my earliest projects as a PhD student was taking a finding from the 80s and just replicating that study, in the 2000s to see if the theories are still making predictions. And by the way, they were. The findings held up just fine. It was mood management theory. Conceptual replications are taking canonical findings, taking those landmark papers, and testing their boundaries. So maybe you take a study on, political attitudes and regime change in a democratic society, and then you apply that to an autocratic society, or you take it from an Eastern culture and apply it to a Western culture. And many people, I think, on the call are probably familiar with this. In fact, my suspicion is we do far more conceptual replications than we actually give ourselves credit for. But we do very few to no exact replications. And there is a paper by Totsky and Keating from 2019 in the Annals of Communication, the Annals of the International Communication Association, that made that very claim. Likewise, when we do replication studies, we also help add to cumulative knowledge, right? Because now we're starting to see what happens when you can trace the lineage of a theory or a perspective or a finding across time. Keeping in mind that a failed replication doesn't necessarily mean the original work was wrong, right? In many ways, for some phenomena, we might expect non-replication. I've seen research on Facebook where, some of the ways in which we approached Facebook in 2004, when it was a relatively closed system of young college students, versus 2020, when Facebook is a very open system with, 1/3 the world's population, we'd probably expect some of the dynamics in that program to change. And that wouldn't mean the original researchers were wrong necessarily, as it is that things have changed over time. So replicating things and failing to replicate things both add to cumulative knowledge. And likewise, if we believe in replication studies, we also start to pull away from the idea that null effects aren't important. If you are publishing a manuscript and you are taking a well-known theory, let's say you're looking at agenda building research and it turns out that you have evidence to believe that it doesn't exist anymore, that paper and those null results are probably going to get published somewhere. Another point of open science, which might sound a little outside the bounds, but it has to do with collaboration. And what I'm talking about when I say collaboration is involving several colleagues, many labs. The image on screen, believe it or not, that is the front page of a single manuscript that was published with the Association of Psychological Science. And it was called the Mini Labs Study. I think they had something like 100 different laboratories trying to replicate different psychological science studies from the past decades. And you can click on that link and read more about it. But one of the things about communication science is we tend to have small samples. We oftentimes still privilege single-authored papers. And one of the things that happens when you start working alone and working in isolation is you don't have those checks and balances. You don't have the resources to do an appropriately powered study that actually would replicate. I mean, the number of times we've probably published papers and we failed to achieve statistical significance, but it's because we had a, remarkably small sample size. And I'm not talking about inflating your sample size only to find statistical significance. I'm talking about scenarios where you probably actually had a pretty strong effect. You just had a super small sample. Or a non-representative sample, which is a very big problem in the social sciences. Having collaborators helps us, pool resources. It also builds in immediate replication opportunities. A lot of my work at Zhengda was working on my own perceived demand research with video games and VR, and it was translating my scales into Mandarin. It was replicating studies I had already done in Texas and doing the exact same studies in Taipei, just to see if I could, if we found differences, there could be interesting differences in technological acceptance between the cultures. And of course, if we didn't expect there to be differences, we can run multiple studies and make sure that we're not reporting data anomalies, right? It also helps us catch early errors. I had a really unfortunate scenario not 3 days ago where one of my doctoral students was replicating one of my colleagues' published manuscripts, and my doctoral student found some data reporting errors in the paper, and it was in a very high-ranking media psychology journal. And fortunately, they were very silly mistakes. Something was coded incorrectly, and it's all being fixed now. It won't require a retraction. But you sometimes wonder that if you had people checking and balancing your work, if you could avoid those, very human errors. So collaboration is not so much an open science practice per se, but it helps encourage and facilitate open science practices. Likewise, fostering skills. Look, let's be honest, we're talking about open science practices, and very few of us learned any of this. In fact, I didn't learn any of this until after I had received tenure. So there is a lot of training involved in this process. We need to improve our skills and knowledge. But if we do engage in more open science skill training, it starts to help establish open science as a de facto approach to the scientific method. So at Texas Tech, a lot of our doctoral students will do replication studies, or we work with all of them to share their data and share their materials early on in their research career. Here on the slide, I provided a couple different resources you might use. And not to mention, please consider me a resource if you'd ever like to talk more one-on-one about open science training. For the different journals in our field, We recommend different open science guidelines, and TOP is considered one of them. I put a link on the page. And there are some debates around whether or not this particular set of standards has to be adopted. What you see here is an excerpt for how these guidelines are put into place. And what this happens is it's rating journals in terms of their adherence to open science practices. So if you look at like data transparency, maybe a level 1 journal requires articles to state whether or not their data is going to be shared. And a level 2 journal might require all the articles published in it to share their data, or give an explicit reason why they can't. And you might see like in a level 3 journal, it could go even further to where the journal is going to require you to not only share your data, but also have somebody else independently reproduce your results. You can imagine these guidelines are a bit controversial, and not everybody agrees with these different levels. That being said, I think the broader point about guidelines like these, and topfactor.org, you can read the entire set of top guidelines that are given to journals. And the journals are given scores, by the way, scores of 1, 2, and 3, based on several other criteria besides data transparency. But when journals take open science practices seriously, they demonstrate the practices to the greater community. And if we're being very upfront, journals do hold a lot of sway into the social norms of our field. Some would argue one of the reasons that p-hacking is assumed to be so prevalent is because we're encouraged to publish statistically significant results. So when you have these guidelines in place, the editors and really the journals can motivate and encourage and guide change. And finally, the last one, again, this is really more of a broad point and probably an open science adjacent point, but it's to consider whether or not we can start to incentivize open science practices. If we can reward people for engaging in transparency, which might lead to longer term changes towards an open science culture to where these things aren't seen as foreign and weird, but instead they're seen as accepted and even sort of assumed practices. I've seen some granting agencies that have already started to require data sharing and other material sharing as part of their funding charges. So we can think about ways in which we might be able to incentivize the practice as a way to shift the culture. When I was the editor of Communication Research Reports, I was the first editor to require effect size reporting. And all it took was requiring effect size reporting to incentivize the practice. And before you know it, every manuscript in the journal reported some estimate of explained variance. So the final two sections of this presentation are going to be rather short. I wanted to keep this video somewhat short so we'd have more time to talk online. And again, I regret we couldn't be face-to-face and I couldn't feed off of your energy and talk to you during the presentation. But let's cover some concerns rather quickly, and then let's talk about some ways you can integrate these practices. So, of course, there are costs to open science, and they have to do with exposure, heuristics, and labor. And I'm going to talk about all three of these. And I just want to say broadly that, of course, open science is not the solution to everything, but it does help. So one major concern to open science is exposure. That not only are we exposing ourselves to a lot of scrutiny and to a lot of critique, right? Nobody wants to get the phone call that says we coded a variable incorrectly and now our data won't reproduce. But we're also exposing our participants. So on screen here, there is a relatively infamous story that it wasn't too long after the open science framework started that researchers were uploading data files with identifiable information, and it was pretty bad. There's absolutely, anytime we're talking about being science is communal and we're sharing everything, we're also exposing ourselves. And I want to come back to this point in terms of political communication. The second thing is avoiding the heuristic that just because a paper engages in open science doesn't mean it's good research. And more importantly, just because a paper doesn't engage open science doesn't make it bad research. We're already seeing people who are engaging these heuristics in problematic ways. I've seen this as an editor myself, where a reviewer will say, well, I'm not so sure about your data, but you shared the data, so I trust you. And that's not really appropriate. The point of sharing the data is for it to be vetted, not to serve as a quality heuristic, or most critically, people being punished for not wanting to or being allowed to engage in open science practices. Finally, the labor involved. Let's just be very honest. It does take extra time to manage this content. And it's one thing to have it all on your computer and have file names that only you understand and have data codes that only you understand. But it's very different when you're giving that stuff to other people. We have to be cognizant of that. Please hit me with more concerns during the question and answer session. I do not want to blow these concerns off. In fact, to get you thinking a little bit, with the last 5 or 6 minutes, I want to tap a couple that might be relevant to political communication. I can think of 3: bad actors, media coverage, and fair use. So, if you're researching political topics, there's a really good chance that there are individuals out there who are interested in your research, but for their own end goals and their own motives. And you might be studying a relatively complex issue, and you've got a manuscript that does a beautiful job of taking your data and explaining this complex issue, and then somebody comes along and downloads your data and wants to tell their own story. And I could see that being a particular threat in political communication. And so there might be ways you have to do some translational work in your open science spaces to make sure people know how to use the materials that you're sharing. Another one's media coverage. You might expect increased media attention to your materials. I had a scenario at Communication Research Reports where a major U.S. newspaper was publishing a story based on a manuscript and based on data that they received from an open science file, where the manuscript and the data were still being reviewed by the journal, and we had actually identified some pretty critical flaws in the research. Yet the material and the manuscript and an interview with the authors made the front page of this major newspaper. That scared me as an editor, and I had to really work with the newspaper and the authors to explain why that was inappropriate. In medicine, they refer to the Engelfinger rule that basically says that, we shouldn't be publishing findings until they've vetted peer review. And I also realized that that is not something we all agree on. Even in our open science author group, there were plenty of people who talked about preprints, where researchers will publish their findings as unpublished manuscripts, but they shared them with the general public. And of course, well, what does it mean if people can already read the research? And I can talk with you about my perspective on that and how it fits into an open science framework. Another one's fair use, right? You may not have permissions to share study data, especially if the data is not readily available. So if you're pulling data from a Twitter or a social media fire hose, or if I understand in China, you're supposed to pay a small fee to reproduce media materials. So if you did a content analysis of newspapers, you don't have the right to necessarily share those newspapers in your open science space. So we should definitely talk about, fair usage and whether or not you can actually engage these materials. Is the data yours to share? And again, let's talk about these things during the Q&A. So some first steps towards open science, I'm really going to end on one slide and then give you my contact information. Consider a layered approach. So myself and Justin Keene wrote an article where we tried to explain to scholars how they could handle and process and work with the idea of open science in a way that wasn't overwhelming and wasn't scary. Think about an onion. And the outside layers have the most protection, but the least transparency. And so our current paradigm is roughly going to be this, by author request. And we put this in our papers all the time. If you email me, I'll send you my stuff. I'm going to encourage you to peel that layer off and try out the shared materials layer. It's the first layer of the onion, where maybe you just try going to Open Science Framework, osf.io, and you upload your survey or your experimental protocol. Documents that you've already prepared for your research, that don't cost you anything, that you know other people would want to see your survey items or your scale items. I might encourage you to see how you're comfortable with that. In fact, that's how I started with Open Science. I started by sharing materials. And then I got more brave, and I shared my materials, and I also shared my data output files to show people that here's how I got the numbers that I got. And then eventually, before you know it, I had no problem going down towards the bullseye, right? Realizing, of course, that you might never go towards the bullseye, and that's okay. But peel off that layer, right, to go back, try out that first one. Let's talk more. My email is nick.bowman@ttu.edu. I'm on Twitter at Bowman Spartan. I've got a couple of links to different open science manuscripts here. And most importantly, I want to thank you for your time today. I've really appreciated this, and I hope you have as well. Take care.